My name is Claire Dawson. I am 34 years old. On the afternoon, my brother was celebrated for making captain. He raised his beer in my direction and called me the quitter of the family in front of 42 people, and I was standing near my father's rusting tomato cages holding a paper plate with a half-eaten roast beef sandwich on it, and I did not say a single word. I had not said a word about a lot of things for 3 years by then, and I was very practiced at it. What I was not prepared for was the sound of car tires on the driveway behind me, or the particular quality of quiet that spread through that backyard 20 minutes after my brother's toast, or the voice that said, "Which one of you is Claire Dawson?" like a sentence that had been rehearsed only enough to make it sound unrehearsed. When I turned around, a man in pressed khakis and a light blue shirt was walking across the grass with a flat wooden case under his arm, and he looked at me the way certain people look at you when they have already decided what they came to say, and the saying is the only thing left to do. Before that September afternoon was over, every person in that yard was going to learn something. Some of them were going to learn it about me. One of them was going to learn it about himself. I joined the United States Army at 18 years old in the summer of 2008. This is not a story about how I was born knowing what I wanted or how some recruiter gave a speech that changed my life. The truth is quieter than that and more specific. My father came home from his second deployment when I was 12, and something about the way he walked into the kitchen that day was different from the way he had left. It was not dramatic. He was not visibly broken. He came in and set his bag down, and my mother hugged him, and he held her for a long time with his eyes open. And when he finally sat down at the dinner table, he chose the chair with his back to the wall and his face toward the room. He had always sat at the head of the table before. Now he sat where he could see everything. I watched him do that every meal for the next 6 years. I watched him scan doorways when we walked into restaurants. I watched him sit in movie theaters near the aisle and near the exit. One evening when I was 15, I finally asked him why he sat that way. Back to the wall, face to the room, and he said, "So I can see what's coming." I said, "Do you always need to see what's coming?" And he thought about it for a moment and said, "It's just a habit now." I asked if it helped, and he said, "Yeah, it helps." Then he passed the green beans. I thought about that answer for 3 years. The way he said it helped, but could not fully explain why or what it helped with exactly. I started sitting with my back to walls in places where it felt like a reasonable option. Not because I was scared, but because I wanted to know what the habit felt like from the inside. I wanted to understand what it meant to organize your body around the possibility of something happening. By the time I was 17, I understood enough to know I wanted more of that understanding, and by the time I was 18, I had signed the paperwork. The recruiter was a staff sergeant named Paulson, who shook my hand and told me I had good hands for medicine. He didn't know that I had spent the previous 2 years watching medical documentaries and reading field medicine manuals I had ordered online, because I thought they might help me understand the gap between the people who came back whole and the people who came back otherwise. I became a combat medic. 68 Whiskey is the Army job code, and it is not a designation that shows up in the kind of speeches that get made at promotion parties. You are not the one with the plan. You are the one who shows up after the plan has encountered reality and tries to limit the distance between what happened and what could still be recovered. You work on the ground and you work fast, and sometimes you work in conditions where the thing keeping you alive is the same thing keeping your patient from getting worse, which is the specific discipline of not thinking about anything that is not the next 30 seconds. I spent 2 years in training and in stateside assignments that felt like waiting. Then I did a deployment to Iraq in 2012, 11 months in a forward support company near Mosul, and I came back different in the way that my father had come back different. The reorganization, not visible from the outside, but structural. The way a building looks the same after the foundation settles, but the walls know. I did a second Iraq deployment in 2014, 9 months, and I came back from that one and sat in my apartment in Killeen, Texas for 6 hours without unpacking my bag. Not because I was in distress, but because I needed to locate myself in the room before I moved through it, and I understood then that the habit my father had built was also building itself in me. I called him that night, and he answered on the second ring, and I said, "Hey, Dad, I'm back." And he said, "Good." And we talked for 4 minutes about nothing important. And then he said, "Come home when you can." And I said I would. I didn't tell him about the 6 hours. He probably would have understood, which is partly why I didn't say it. The third deployment was Afghanistan in the fall of 2021. I had been in the Army for 11 years by then. I was 31 years old, and I knew my job the way you know a language you have been living in long enough that you no longer translate it in your head. You simply move through it. I had a chronic ache in my lower back from a bad jump in 2017 that I had underreported, because underreporting was what you did when the alternative was being sidelined from your unit. And I had learned to manage it with a specific stretching routine in the mornings and by ignoring it the rest of the time. The ache was like certain kinds of noise, present enough to be real, ignorable enough to work around. On October the 14th, 2021, something happened in Kandahar province that I cannot describe in its full detail because most of it is still classified, and the part that is not classified is still not entirely mine to tell. What I can tell you is that on that day, I was attached to a forward medevac team. What I can tell you is that the situation the team encountered was not the situation anyone had planned for. What I can tell you is that when I drove from Fort Knox to Columbus, Ohio, on a December afternoon, 8 weeks after that day, I had a piece of shrapnel in my lower back that I had not disclosed, and a series of events on my record that were not on any public document, and a very clear understanding that the specifics of what I had done on that particular October afternoon were classified and would remain classified for a length of time that no one could give me a precise number for. I signed the forms. I understood the forms. I came home. My brother Derek had been in the army for 4 years by the time I got out. He had made first lieutenant and was on track for captain. And he told good stories about his guys and his unit and his leadership decisions. He had the kind of career that produced visible, nameable, sayable things, the kind of things that fit into the sentences people say at dinner tables and backyard parties, promotions, commendations, photos. The kind of recognition that you can describe in one sentence to someone who has never set foot on a military installation and they understand immediately what it means. My career had produced things that did not fit in those sentences. The things I had done were in classified documents, and in the specific way certain people looked at me when they thought I wasn't noticing, I was always noticing. The word quitter started showing up in the months after I came home. Not always directly. My Aunt Linda said she had always thought I would make it to retirement. My Uncle Bob said it was a shame I hadn't stuck it out. A cousin at Thanksgiving said, "Didn't you like it?" Which is a question that has no correct answer because the answer is neither yes nor no, and any version of the truth is classified. Derek said it most openly. In that particular way, he had of wrapping a cut inside a compliment, something like, well, some people are built for the long game, and some people figure out they need something different, and he would say it with a tone that placed himself in the first category without quite saying so. I ate my chicken, I said I was fine, I passed the green beans. I had been working at the VA hospital on the east side of Columbus for 8 months when my mother called to tell me about the party. It was a Tuesday in early August, and I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gotten cold while I was reading a patient file. And she said, "We're having the party for Derek on the 23rd of September. You should come. Not that I hope you will be there or that it would mean a lot to have you there. You should come," with the specific tone my mother uses for things that are obligations dressed as invitations. I said I would try, and she said, "It would mean a lot to Derek." And then she talked for 11 more minutes about whether to do a taco bar or sandwich trays, and I said the sandwich trays sounded good. And she said she thought so too, and we said goodbye, and I sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes after and thought about what I was going to wear to a party, where I was going to be the context that made Derek look better, by comparison. I worked at the VA because it was where I could do the work that mattered to me in the situation I was in. I am not going to pretend it was glamorous. I was a patient care technician, which means I did vitals, and I assisted, and I sat with people who were in the specific category of needing someone to sit with them, who understood the language they were speaking without having to define every term. I had men on my caseload who had the same quality of silence my father had, the trained silence, the operational silence that had become personal and then become structural, the way a tree grows around a fence post and eventually the fence post is just part of the tree. I knew that silence from the inside. I could sit in it with them without getting uncomfortable, which is a skill that turns out to be rarer than any of the clinical ones. The work was good, the hours were early and long, and the pay was not what anyone would call competitive, but the meaning was clear and direct and I understood it, which is not something I had said about every situation in my post-army life. I drove to work in a 2016 Tacoma that I refused to replace no matter what the mechanic told me about its undercarriage, partly because I liked it and partly because I had a rule about not replacing things that still did what they were supposed to do even if they looked a little worse for it. The morning of September the 23rd, I stood in front of my closet for 40 minutes. This was not a clothing problem. I own adequate clothing. This was an armor problem. The specific calculation of what to wear to a situation where everything about you is going to be read as a statement, where your presence is going to be interpreted as either defeat or defiance, and neither reading is accurate, and you cannot correct it because the accurate version is classified. I texted Rosie at 8:14 in the morning and said, I don't think I'm going to make it today. She texted back in under a minute and said, I'm already in my car, come outside. Rosie Nguyen has been my best friend since we were 7 years old, and she sat next to me on a field trip bus and handed me half of her Rice Krispies treat without being asked because she said I looked like I was thinking too hard about something, and thinking too hard uses fuel. She is Vietnamese American, and she is 4 feet 11 inches tall, and she has the specific kind of energy that takes up rooms in a way that has nothing to do with volume. She arrived at my apartment building in her green Subaru with 2 large coffees from the place on 5th that I like, and a paper bag from the bakery 3 blocks down. And she said, get in, you don't have to talk, and I got in. I am chronically early to things that I look forward to and chronically late to things that I approach, like a hostage negotiation, and the fact that she had factored in a bakery stop suggested. She understood we had some time to burn. We did not talk much on the drive. Rosie had something instrumental on the radio, low enough that it was atmosphere rather than music, and she drove with both hands on the wheel the way she does when she's thinking about something she has decided not to say yet. I watched Columbus go by the window and let my brain go where it went, which was not quite to Kandahar and not quite to the specific afternoon I was driving toward, but somewhere between them, the way you exist between two things you're not prepared for. My lower back started doing its morning argument at about the 20-minute mark. The familiar deep pull that the physical therapist called manageable, and that I called a feature of being awake in cold weather. I shifted slightly in the seat, and Rosie glanced at me and did not say anything, which is one of the primary reasons she is my best friend. We turned onto my parents' street at 12:43. The party started at noon, which meant I had successfully converted an obligation to arrive on time into an obligation to arrive slightly late, which felt like the only available control I had over the situation. Cars were lined on both sides of the street, more than I expected, and someone had tied a blue balloon to the mailbox at the end of my parents' walk, and I could hear the sound of 40-some people being social before we even got out of the car. Rosie said, you want me to go first? And I said, no. And she said, I'm right here. And I said, I know. And we went around the side of the house to the back gate. The yard looked like my mother had planned it, which means it looked exactly the way she had decided it should look, and everything unnecessary had been removed. The rented folding tables had navy and white tablecloths. The sandwich trays were arranged on the food table with bowls of potato salad and a cut fruit platter that nobody was touching yet. The banner ran between the oak tree and the back fence. Captain Derek Dawson, we knew you'd make it, in navy letters on white vinyl, and it caught the September light in a way that made it extremely visible from most points in the yard. There was a keg of light beer near the fence, and my father's old green cooler was next to it with the sodas and lemonade. My Aunt Linda was the first person to see me. She is my mother's younger sister, and she has a specific way of registering a person's arrival that starts at their feet and works up. A full scan before she decides to engage, and she did this to me, and then smiled with her mouth closed and said, Claire, I'm glad you could come. I said, hi, Aunt Linda. She said, how are you doing these days? And I said, I'm good, working at the VA on the east side. And she said, oh yes, that must be very satisfying work, in the voice she uses when she means something else entirely. I said it was, and she said, good, and her attention had already begun to drift past me towards something more interesting on the other side of the yard. My cousin Marcus found me near the sandwich table before I had finished building my plate. He is Aunt Linda's oldest son, and he has been 6 feet 2 inches since he was 16, and he has used that height primarily to lean over people's heads and look at things behind them, which is a posture I find exhausting to be on the receiving end of. He said, hey, Claire, and I said, hey, Marcus. And he said, you look tired, and I said, I'm fine, and Rosie appeared at my elbow and said, she looks great, Marcus. And Marcus did the specific expression of a person who has been corrected by someone shorter than him and is not sure how to process it. I made 2 circuits of the yard in the first 30 minutes. I talked to my father's colleague from the plant who has known our family since Derek and I were in elementary school and who asked good practical questions about the VA work that I could answer fully and honestly. I talked to my cousin Dana, who had brought her 3-year-old daughter and who asked if I had ever thought about having kids, and I said I was focused on other things right now, and she nodded with a specific nod of a woman who has decided not to pursue that line of conversation. I ate the potato salad, which my mother had made from the recipe she got from her own mother, and which is, objectively, the best potato salad in Franklin County. I drank a lemonade and let the yard be what it was, and I kept my breathing deliberate and my posture easy, and I did not look at the banner more than necessary. Uncle Bob got to me at about the hour mark. Bob is my father's older brother, which makes him a lifelong adherent to the idea that the Army builds men in ways that require a certain longevity of commitment to fully measure, and he delivered this opinion with the efficiency of a man who has delivered it many times before. He said it was good to see me, and he said he had always thought the Army was a natural fit for me, my father having served and all, and that it was a shame I hadn't been able to see it through. I said, Bob, I served 11 years and 3 deployments. He said, well, sure, of course, but you were so young still. And I said, I was 31 when I got out. And he said, that's my point exactly, still had time. And I understood then that this conversation was not going to be resolved to either of our satisfaction. So I took a long drink of my lemonade and said something about the sandwiches and moved on. The backache had progressed by 1 o'clock to the specific stage I thought of as the third gear, not the morning stiffness and not yet the end-of-day exhaustion, but the sustained middle pressure that lives in the space between my shoulder blade and my L4 vertebra, which is the exact path the piece of shrapnel took on October the 14th in Kandahar, and which the surgeon in Germany described as a clean enough extraction that the long-term implications would be manageable with appropriate physical therapy. I had done appropriate physical therapy for 2 years. The implications were manageable. They were also constant, and standing on a concrete patio for extended periods without a good reason to sit down is one of the conditions they are most apparent under. So I found an empty folding chair near the oak tree and sat in it and watched the party from there and let my back settle. My father found me at that chair. He came around the edge of the food table with a plate of food and a beer and sat in the empty chair beside me without asking if it was occupied, which is one of his habits that I have always found comforting. He looked at the yard for a moment and said, "You drive yourself." And I said, "Rosie brought me." And he said, "Good." And then he ate a bite of sandwich and I ate a bite of mine, and we watched the party together in the comfortable silence that I think is what I inherited most directly from him. After a minute he said, "You doing all right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Good." And that was the extent of it. But he didn't leave. He sat there with me for another 20 minutes and ate his food, and we watched the yard together, and that was the right thing. And I knew he knew it was the right thing, and I was grateful for it in a way I did not say. I saw Derek for the first time at about 2:15. He had been working the party in the way he worked all rooms, in a circuit, arriving and departing from each group with the momentum of someone who has places to be but is generously sharing his time with you, and his laugh had been carrying across the yard all afternoon in a way that meant I always knew where he was without having to look. He came up to me at the drinks table when I was refilling my lemonade, and he clapped me on the shoulder with the flat enthusiasm of someone expressing affection in a language that is easy to deploy without committing to anything it might cost you. And he said, "Hey, you made it." And I said, "Congratulations, Derek. Captain is big." And he said, "Yeah, it's been a really good run." And he said it with the specific tone of someone who is used to good runs and considers them an appropriate reflection of their efforts, which they probably are. Mostly. Then he looked at me with the smile he uses when he is about to say something true that he wants to be able to take back if it lands wrong, and he said, "I was honestly a little surprised you came." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Figured you might be busy." And he gestured at nothing. At the air to my left, at the general territory of whatever my life contained, that was not this party and not whatever his life contained. I said, "I wouldn't miss it," and he held my eyes for a beat that was a half second too long. And then someone across the yard called his name, and he turned with the ease of a man who is never sorry to have somewhere to be. My mother gave her speech at 3 o'clock. She called for attention the way she does, with a fork against a glass, that she controlled with the precision of a woman who has orchestrated family gatherings for 30 years and understands the acoustics of a backyard. And the yard quieted around her, and she said the things she had prepared to say. She said Derek had always been destined for this, the way parents say when they want something they believed in to feel prophetic. She said watching him serve had been one of the proudest experiences of her life. She said she knew his father shared that feeling, and she looked at my father in his folding chair, and he nodded once, and people smiled at that, at the family completeness of it. She did not look at me. I want to be precise about this because I thought about it later, and I am certain it was not a deliberate exclusion. The camera of her attention was pointed at the center of the picture, and I was at the edge of it. And the edge is where I had been for 3 years, not because she put me there on purpose, but because the center moves toward light, and the light had been pointed at Derek's career for long enough that it felt like the natural arrangement. I stood near the oak tree with Rosie beside me and watched my mother speak, and I held my paper plate and I breathed through the backache, and I did not expect anything different. Derek took the floor when my mother stepped back. He thanked her with the specific gratitude of a child who has been publicly championed by a parent and knows it and wants to return the favor in kind. He thanked my father, and he thanked his guys. And he told a story about a training exercise that had something going wrong in a funny way that was also a story about his quick thinking, and the yard laughed in the right places. Because Derek tells stories well. It has always been one of his best things. The ability to hold a room's attention with the shape of a narrative, to build to the moment and let it land and then move on before the laugh fades. And then he said, and I want to give a special shout out to the quitter in the family, my sister Claire, who couldn't quite hack it to captain herself, but hey, she showed up today, so he raised his beer at me. Some people laughed. Not the whole yard, maybe a third of it, the people who were close enough to hear him clearly and who defaulted to laughing at things that sounded like jokes in the mouths of people who were having good days. Some people did the uncomfortable laugh, the half-second exhalation that means they felt the sharpness but did not know what to do with it in a party context. My cousin Marcus laughed the longest. My Aunt Linda made a small sound of appreciation. Rosie went completely still beside me, the specific stillness of a very small person who is managing something very large. I did not move. I held my paper plate. I looked at my brother with the expression I use when I am managing something I am not going to address in this particular moment, in this particular room, in front of this particular crowd. I had 11 years of practice at that expression. It sits comfortably on my face. People read it as composure. It is composure. But it is also a door that has been locked, and the decision about whether to unlock it is not one I was going to make in a backyard with lemonade and a banner that had someone else's name on it. Derek moved on. He finished the speech. The yard came back to life around me, the way yards do. The separate conversations resuming, the sound level rising, the particular social mechanism of recovery from a moment that was too sharp to be comfortable operating exactly as designed. Rosie put her hand on my elbow and said, "You want to go get more potato salad?" And I said yes, and we went to the food table and I put more potato salad on my plate and I did not eat any of it. Aunt Linda was saying something to the woman beside her, a neighbor I didn't know, and I caught the tail end of it when I passed them with my plate. "It's such a shame," she was saying, and I kept walking and found a spot near the back fence and stood there and ate the potato salad I had put on my plate without tasting any of it and thought about whether I was done with this afternoon. I went inside at 3:20. I didn't make a production of it. I went through the back door and down the hall to the downstairs bathroom and I turned on the light and I ran cold water over my wrists for 30 seconds, which is something I started doing in the army when I needed to locate myself in a room and had about 90 seconds to do it. And then I looked at the mirror and looked at the towels my mother had put out, the pale blue embroidered ones she saves for company, and I thought about leaving. Not dramatically, not walking out to make a statement, just getting Rosie and going back to my apartment and sitting in my kitchen with the window cracked and the television on, with the sound off, and not being in that yard anymore. I had done things that required composure in conditions where composure was the rarest available resource. I could survive a backyard party. I knew that. But there is a specific kind of tired that lives below the level of effort and capability that is not about whether you can do something, but about whether you can do it one more time without something in you going quiet in a way that takes a while to restart. And I was at the edge of that tired, and the afternoon had an hour left in it. Rosie knocked at 3:27. She said my name, just that. And I said, "I'm fine." And she said, "I know. I just wanted to tell you there's a car in the driveway, and the man who got out of it is asking for you specifically." I said, "Who is it?" And she said, "He didn't say his name yet, but he's got a wooden case like a box, and the way he carries himself is making Uncle Bob stop talking, and Uncle Bob doesn't stop talking." I looked at the towels for another second. Then I opened the door. I came around the corner of the house into the backyard, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not complete silence. The yard still had ambient noise, birds, someone's distant music, a car on the street, but the particular human noise of 42 people at a party had dropped several levels, the way sound drops when a room senses something is about to become significant before it has actually decided to be significant. People had shifted position without planning to, the self-organizing movement of a crowd that has detected a change in the center of gravity. Colonel James Merritt was standing near the oak tree. He was 62 years old and he was in civilian clothes, the light blue shirt and the pressed khakis Rosie had mentioned, and he held a flat wooden case with both hands in front of him, not like a man showing something off, but like a man returning something he has been trusted to carry. He had the stillness of someone who has learned to be in rooms the hard way, the back-to-the-wall kind of stillness that is not tension but discipline, the body's trained awareness expressing itself as a kind of absolute calm. He was not large. He was not visually commanding in any simple sense. He was the kind of person whose presence made you understand immediately that he had been in rooms where what you said and how you moved and what you decided in the next 15 seconds had consequences that were still playing out, and that he had learned to be very precise in all three. He looked at me across the yard and said, "Claire Dawson." Not a question. I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm Colonel James Merritt, retired, and I think you know who I am." I said, "Yes, sir, I do." He said, "I owe you an apology. I'm going to give it to you now, and I'm going to give you what I came to give you. And I'd like to say a few things in front of these people, if that's all right with you." He said it directly to me. The way a person speaks when the only audience that matters to them in the room is one specific person. He said, "There's been a partial declassification in the last 6 weeks on something that has been on my desk for 3 years." He looked at me. "Is it all right if I speak?" I said yes. He said, "On October the 14th, 2021, in Kandahar province, Afghanistan, there was an operation that is not in any public record and that I cannot describe in full detail today. What I can describe is what I am able to speak to in front of witnesses under the terms of that partial declassification." He paused, and the yard paused with him. He said, "A forward medevac team was grounded that afternoon under active fire with multiple critically wounded personnel. The team's pilot was incapacitated. The extraction window that command had calculated as viable was no longer viable. There was no reasonable option available that did not involve unacceptable additional casualties. And the word reasonable is the word I want you to hear. Because what happened next was not reasonable in the technical sense. It was something else." He said, "The combat medic attached to that team made a decision to manage 3 critical patients simultaneously under fire while coordinating a ground extraction with personnel from 2 separate units who were not part of the original mission profile. She did this for 114 minutes. She managed triage, communication, and intervention on 3 critical patients continuously for 114 minutes while the fire situation did not resolve. She did not break communication. She did not lose a patient. She loaded 11 people onto ground transport, and all 11 of them made it to surgical care, and every one of them is alive today." He stopped. He let that sit in the yard for a moment, the way a good speaker lets something important sit without adding anything to it that would dilute it. Then he said, "And she did all of that with a piece of shrapnel in her back that she chose not to disclose until every member of her team was loaded and accounted for." The yard was so quiet, I could hear the September wind moving in the oak tree. Colonel Merritt said, when the debrief happened, she was told that her specific involvement in this operation was classified and that formal recognition would have to wait. He said it evenly, but I heard the particular flatness in his voice that tells you a person is choosing not to editorialize on something they have strong feelings about. He said, "I have been waiting 3 years for the right day, and the classification moved enough 6 weeks ago that today is that day." He held up the case. He said, "This is a Bronze Star with the Valor device." He said it the way you say something that does not need decoration. "This belongs to Claire Dawson. It has belonged to her since November of 2021, and I am sorry it took this long to get it here." He held the case out to me. I walked across the grass and took it. It was lighter than I expected. It was heavier than anything I had picked up in 3 years. When I opened it, the metal looked the way it looks, which is not decorative so much as factual. The way certain things look when they are the accurate record of something that happened, not a representation of it. I did not know what to do with my face, so I looked at the metal. After a moment, I looked up. The first person I looked at was my father, because my eyes went there before I decided to send them anywhere, and he had stood up from his folding chair and he was standing with the specific posture he has when he is containing something large and not performing the containing for anyone's benefit. His eyes were doing something I had not seen them do in a long time. My brother Derek was standing about 12 feet to my left. The beer was in his hands, but he was not drinking it, and he was not holding it with any casual intent. He was looking at Colonel Merritt with an expression I had not seen on his face in 34 years of knowing him. Something between attention and reckoning. The specific look of a person who has just had the ground shift under something they built. Colonel Merritt said, "There's one more thing I'd like to say, if the family doesn't mind." He looked at Derek. "Captain Dawson, I believe you are Claire's brother." Derek said, "Yes, sir." Colonel Merritt said, "I'm not going to make a thing of this, but I think you should hear it." He said, "Are you familiar with an engagement log from your unit? November of 2021, the reroute through the secondary valley in the Jiaojian corridor." Derek went still in a different way than he had been still before. He said, "Yes, sir. I made that call. We rerouted through the secondary valley because the primary approach had a history of contact, and my assessment was that the secondary route presented lower risk. We got through clean. It's something I've talked about at debriefs as an example of field judgment." Colonel Merritt said, "Yes." He said, "The secondary valley was passable because a team ran a clearance operation there 2 weeks before your convoy moved through it." He said, "That operation was the one I just described. Your sister's team created the conditions that made your route viable. She had no knowledge your convoy was going to use it. She was doing her mission. But the clearance her team ran is documented as the reason that corridor was accessible in that window." He said it the way you state a geographic fact, without drama, without emphasis beyond what the truth required. He said, "It's in a file that's been classified until recently. I thought you should know it." The yard was silent. Derek looked at me. He looked at me the way he used to look at me when we were kids, and he had broken something of mine and did not know how to put it back together. I had not seen that look on his face in a long time. He had grown past it, or grown around it, the way people grow around the parts of themselves that are hard to carry. And now it was back, and it was older and more complicated than it had been when we were children, and the broken thing was a cassette player or a bike. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "My name. Just my name." I said, "I know, Derek." My mother made a sound that was not words. It was the sound she makes when something is too large for words and she is not ready to find them yet. She had both hands at her sides and she was looking at me with an expression I had not seen her wear in this context before. Not the concerned mother expression and not the party host expression, but something underneath both of those, something personal and unguarded, and I thought, a little frightened. Aunt Linda had moved to the back of the group near the drinks table and was examining the selection with focused attention. Uncle Bob was looking at the patio. Marcus was looking at his phone. Rosie put her hand on my arm. Just her hand on my arm. Not a squeeze and not a comment, just contact, the specific warmth of someone standing beside you who has always stood beside you and is not about to start doing anything different now. Colonel Merritt said, "I'm going to step inside and give you all some time." He looked at me. "I have some paperwork that is yours. I'll find you before I leave." He nodded once at my father, who nodded back with the slow, specific gravity of two men who share a category of experience and recognize each other across it. And then Colonel Merritt went through the back door of the house, and the party reconfigured itself without quite knowing what to do next. What happened in the following minutes did not happen in the sequence I would have written if I were writing it. My mother came to me first, and she took both of my hands in both of hers, and she looked at my face for a long time without speaking. When she finally spoke, she said, "Why didn't you tell us?" And I said, "I couldn't. Mom, it was classified." And she said, "A medal, Claire." And I said, "I know." And she said it again. "A medal?" And I said, "It's okay, Mom." And she said, "It's not." And she was right. It wasn't. And we both knew it. And she held my hands harder. My father put his hand on my shoulder from behind, and I turned around, and he was not a man who cried at things, but he was very close to the edges of what that meant, standing there in the September light. And he said, "I sat at that table and I watched you eat your chicken and I never pushed." And I said, "Dad, you couldn't have known." And he said, "I'm your father, Claire." And I understood that he did not mean it as an accusation. He meant it as a statement about the weight he carried for the things he had chosen not to ask about, the questions he had let go quiet because he recognized the quality of the silence as his own and did not know how to reach into it without making it worse. He was the same kind of quiet that I was. He knew exactly what that silence covered, and he had let it stand because he respected it, and because respecting it felt like the right thing, and it was the right thing, and it had also cost him something. And now he was holding my shoulder and telling me that without saying any of those words. The party changed quality after that. The volume came down, people moved to smaller groups, quieter conversations. Several people said their goodbyes earlier than they might have. Not because they were uncomfortable exactly, but because the afternoon had shifted into something that felt more private than a party, something that needed a smaller room than 42 people. My Aunt Linda left at 4 without saying anything specific to me, just a general goodbye directed at my mother. Uncle Bob shook my hand before he left, and he looked at the wooden case in my hands and he said, "That's something, Claire." And he meant it. And I said, "Thank you, Bob." And I did. Derek found me by the oak tree at about 4:15. The yard had thinned to maybe 15 people by then. The closest family, a few friends who knew to stay when things got real. He came and stood beside me, and we looked at the yard together for a moment, and then he said, "The quitter thing." I said, "It's okay." He said, "It's really not, Claire." I said, "No, it's really not." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know why I keep doing that. I say something like that, and even when I'm saying it, I know it's wrong and I say it anyway." He said it like he was working something out. Not for me, for himself. He said, "I think I needed you to be the one who didn't make it. Because if you had made it and I couldn't talk about what it looked like, then it was like you were ahead of me in a race that had no finish line." I said, "There's no race, Derek." He said, "I know that. I know it up here." He touched the side of his head. "I don't always know it the other way." I said, "I'm not competing with you." He said, "I know that too." He turned to look at me directly and he said, "I've been telling the reroute story for 3 years. I told it at the debrief. I told it at the family dinner in 2022. I've told it as, this is what field judgment looks like when you trust your gut. And I believe that. I genuinely believe that." I said, "You did make the right call." He said, "Based on information I didn't know came from you." I said, "You didn't know where the information came from, but your call was still correct. The route was passable because the team cleared it. The judgment to use that route was yours." He said, "That's a very charitable reading." I said, "It's an accurate one. The decision was yours. The conditions were what they were. You read the conditions and you made the right call. That's leadership, Derek. That's what you've been describing." He said, "But the story is different now." I said, "The story has more context now. That's not the same as being wrong." He looked at the case in my hands. He said, "You didn't tell anyone you had shrapnel in your back." I said, "Not until after." He said, "How long after?" I said, "About 3 hours, until all 11 were loaded." He said, 114 minutes with shrapnel in your back." I said, "It wasn't the most pressing issue at the time." He stared at me for a long moment, and then he said, "That's the most Claire Dawson sentence I've ever heard in my life." And there was something in his voice when he said it that was not humor and was not admiration exactly, but was something else. Something slower and more solid than either of those. Something that I think was the specific feeling of seeing someone clearly for the first time, after a long time of looking at your own idea of them instead. He said, "Does your back still bother you?" I said, "In the cold, mostly. It's manageable." He said, "The PT says it's manageable, or you say it's manageable." I said, "Both, usually." He said, "Claire." I said, "Derek, I'm not telling you this so you'll feel bad." He said, "I know you're not. That's what makes it worse." He rubbed the back of his neck. He said, "I said it in front of everyone. The quitter thing." I said, "I know." He said, "I've been saying versions of it for 3 years." I said, "I know." He said, "Because I needed the room." He said it plainly, the way someone says a thing when they have stopped protecting themselves from saying it. He said, "You were always the one who understood things. I didn't. The thing Dad had, the thing that made him sit with his back to the wall, I never had it the same way. And I never knew how to ask you what it cost you to have it. So instead, I told everyone you quit." I said, "It did cost something." He said, "I know that now." He said, "I think I knew it before and I chose not to look directly at it." I said, "Okay." He said, "Is that enough? I mean, is it enough that I know it now?" I said, "Knowing it and doing something with the knowing are different steps. We can start with the knowing." He looked at me. He said, "I want to do better. I mean it." I said, "I know you do." He said, "How do you know?" I said, "Because you're standing here talking about it instead of inside getting another beer." He almost smiled at that. He didn't quite make it all the way to a smile, but the muscles around it moved in that direction, and I understood that as the equivalent. He said, one of his guys came over and said people were starting to wrap up, and Derek excused himself and went with him, and I stood under the oak tree and held the wooden case and looked at the yard that had been holding all of this all afternoon without knowing it. Colonel Merritt came out of the house at 5:30. He had a manila envelope and he brought it to me in the driveway where I had gone to stand, when the yard started to feel like a room that had been used for something significant and needed to rest. He said, "This is yours. Keep it somewhere safe. You don't have to look at it if you don't want to, but keep it." He said, "The full operational record will be available in 8 to 12 years, maybe longer, depending on how certain other things go. But this is what is legally yours today." He handed it over and I tucked it under my arm beside the case. He said, "The people in that room know what you did. Not this room, the other room." I said, "I know they know." He said, Does that help? I said, most of the time it's easier to be known by the people who were there than by the people at home. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is the most accurate thing I have heard anyone say about this particular situation. I said, how did you find me, sir? He said, I tracked your platoon sergeant, who tracked your discharge address, and then I drove. He looked at the street, the cars thinning out, the afternoon going gold toward evening. He said, I kept the case on my desk for 3 years. I didn't like what it meant that I kept it there. I didn't like what it said about what we owed you and hadn't given you, so I drove. I said, thank you for coming. He said, don't thank me for this one. He said it firmly, not unkindly. He said, this should have happened right when it happened. The fact that it took 3 years to get here reflects a failure on the part of the system, not on your part. I wanted to say that clearly and in person. He shook my hand with both of the specific grip of a man, who means the gesture as a full statement and not a formality. He said, take care of yourself, Claire. Do good work. He got in his car and drove away, and I watched his taillights until they turned at the end of the block. Rosie came out at 5:42 with 2 glasses of sweet tea and sat on the porch step beside me. She handed me a glass, and we sat there while the September evening came in over the rooftops, that specific late afternoon light that goes from amber to rose to the particular thin lavender that exists only for about 11 minutes in early autumn before it gives up and goes dark. A dog somewhere on the block was doing its end-of-day barking at something slow and patient. A car pulled out of the driveway 2 houses down. Rosie drank her tea. She said, do you want to talk? I said, not yet. She said, okay. After a minute, I said, I might want a lemon Danish. She said, I have 2 left in the bag, in the back seat. I said, good planning. She said, I know you. We sat there for a while longer. My lower back had settled into the dull background conversation it has in the evenings, not demanding, just present, the way a neighbor's television sounds through the wall, there, but not urgent. The wooden case was in my lap, and the envelope was leaning against the porch railing, and the sweet tea was exactly the right temperature, and Rosie was sitting beside me, and the dog had stopped barking. My mother came out at 6 o'clock. She came through the front door and sat on the step on the other side of me, and she looked at the case in my lap for a moment before she said anything. Then she said, I want to say I'm sorry. Not the party sorry. Not the hosting sorry. She said, I didn't know how to talk to you after you came home. I said, Mom. And she said, let me say it. She said, I kept waiting for you to tell me something and you didn't. And I decided that meant you were fine because it was easier to decide that than to sit with not knowing. She said, I put Derek's photos on the refrigerator. I said, it's okay. She said, I have 1 photo of you. It's from your first deployment. You're 21 in it. I put it in the kitchen by the window 13 years ago, and it has been there every single morning when I make coffee. She said, you have never once mentioned it, and I have never once taken it down. I did not say anything for a moment. I said, I didn't know it was there. She said, I know you didn't. She said, I know what that says. She put her head on my shoulder the way she used to do when I was small, and she was tired, and I was the nearest thing to lean against. Just for a moment. Then she sat up and said, we should get the food inside before the night comes. And Rosie said, yes to the potato salad, and my mother stood up and went in to start the clearing, and Rosie and I sat there until the street lights came on, which in Columbus in September happens at about 7:40, and then we sat there a little longer after that. Derek texted me at 9:15 that night. I was in my apartment on the couch with the wooden case on the coffee table and the envelope beside it and the television on without sound, which is how I use the television when I need the light and the motion but not the noise. He texted, I've been thinking about what I said today. I know that sorry doesn't fix it, but I mean it. I want to do better, and I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I'm going to figure it out. I wrote back, I believe you. He wrote, you doing okay. I wrote, yeah. He wrote, that colonel is something else. I wrote, he really is. He wrote, you saved 11 people. I wrote back, they made it out. I was just a medic. He wrote, that is such a Claire thing to say. I said, you're not wrong. He said, good night. I said, good night. I put the phone down and I looked at the case on the coffee table and I thought about things for a while without trying to organize them into anything, which is the specific thinking you do when a day has been too large to parse yet, but too important to walk away from. I thought about the 114 minutes. I have thought about them many times in 3 years, always with the same quality of attention. Not pride, not the way I might have expected pride to feel, but a kind of sober recognition, the way you might look at a photograph of something you built and think, yes, that is what I built, and it stands. I thought about the shrapnel that I had not disclosed and about the way the German surgeon said, clean extraction, good news, and I thought about the specific look on Colonel Merritt's face when he had handed me the case. The look of a man returning something that never should have been separated from its owner. I thought about my father standing up from his chair. I thought about my mother's head on my shoulder. I thought about Derek saying, I think I knew it before and I chose not to look directly at it, which is one of the more honest things I have heard my brother say, and I have known my brother for 34 years. I thought about the word quitter. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath it, not to examine the stone but to understand the ground. My brother used that word because he needed me to be less than him, and he needed me to be less than him because some part of him had always understood that the measure of what I was doing was not a measure he could easily match, and the easiest way to live with that was to reclassify what I was doing as a failure rather than as a kind of service that was not going to produce the things that get put on refrigerators and party banners. I am not saying he was right to use it. He wasn't. I am not saying it didn't land. It did. Every time in the place below the ribs where the things that are said about you by the people who are supposed to know you best tend to land, that specific tender geography. I am saying that I understand it now in a way that is different from how I understood it when it was happening. And understanding it that way is not the same as forgiving it, but it is the beginning of what forgiving eventually feels like. I woke up the next morning at 6:47 to the back, starting its conversation, which is the most reliable alarm I own. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the Sunday morning in Columbus, which has a particular quality of quiet that feels like the city is giving itself permission to breathe before the week comes back. I thought about going to work on Monday. I thought about the guys on my caseload, the ones with the trained silence and the operational stillness that had become personal and then structural. I thought about how I sat with them in that silence and how the sitting was the work, and how I had not fully understood until recently how long I had been doing the same sitting by myself, alone, in kitchens and dining rooms and backyard parties, carrying something that no one in the immediate room could see. The wooden case was on the kitchen table beside my coffee cup. I had moved it there from the coffee table at some point in the night when I got up for water, putting it where I would see it in the morning, which is a habit I have with things I need to absorb slowly. I looked at it and thought about Colonel Merritt driving 214 miles because something on his desk was a wrong he wanted to make right. I thought about how the drive itself was a statement, not the words and not the metal, but the miles. The specific commitment of a person who decided that something needed to be done and did not send a letter. Instead, some things need a person in the room. Some truths need to be said out loud in front of witnesses. Not because the truth changes with witnesses, but because the way other people receive a truth changes what it is allowed to mean. In a classified document, what I did on October the 14th is operational data in a backyard in Columbus, Ohio, with 42 people, and a banner with my brother's name on it, and my father standing up from his chair. It was something else. It was my life being returned to me in the right language for the first time. I am not someone who is comfortable being seen. I spent 11 years in a profession where what you did mattered infinitely more than who you were while you were doing it, where your feelings about the situation were absolutely irrelevant to the situation, where the job was the entire available focus and there was no room in the job for the person doing it to require anything for themselves. I came home with that orientation intact, and I have been operating it in a civilian context ever since. And the civilian context does not require that orientation the way the field does. And I know that, and I have still not entirely figured out how to stop. I am early to every appointment I keep at the VA. I reorganize the supply closets when I am nervous. I drive a truck that my mechanic has told me 3 times is approaching the end of its viable life, and I have not replaced it because I have a rule about replacing things that still do what they are supposed to do. I take the long way home sometimes when the back is bad. I sit at the window after the patients are done for the day, and I think about the guys in the waiting room and about what it means to show up for work that no one can fully see, day after day, without the kind of visible recognition that tells the people around you what you have been doing and what it cost. I think about what it means to carry something quietly for a long time and to have that quiet misread as absence or indifference or worse, as giving up. Giving up is the easiest accusation to make against a person you have decided not to fully see. If you can name someone's silence as surrender rather than as choice, then you don't have to reckon with what the silence is protecting. You don't have to ask yourself what it is costing them to maintain it. You don't have to sit in your discomfort with not knowing you can call it quitting and go get another beer and feel like you've understood the situation, when what you've actually done is turned away from something that required you to look harder than you wanted to. Colonel Merritt looked hard. He kept a medal on his desk for 3 years because looking at it reminded him that something owed had not been paid, and he drove 214 miles when the circumstances finally allowed him to pay it. That is not the act of someone turning away. That is the act of someone staying with what they know needs doing until they can do it. I am grateful for it in a way that I will be finding new dimensions of for a long time. I finished my coffee and I stood at the window for another few minutes, and then I got my running shoes out of the closet and I stretched my back the way the physical therapist showed me, and I took a very deliberate walk around the block, which is what I do on Sunday mornings when the weather is above 55 degrees. Because the combination of movement and morning air and the specific quietness of a residential street before 9 in the morning is the clearest head I can give myself for what the week is going to ask of me. I walked past the house on the corner where the older gentleman has a Japanese maple that has been going red for the last 2 weeks, in that particular way. Japanese maples go red in September in Ohio, all at once, like a decision. I walked past the church on Larimer where the parking lot was already beginning to fill with early arrivals, the dedicated ones, the ones who show up before it is required and sit in the quiet before the noise. I walked past the elementary school with its climbing structure in the shape of something that might have been a rocket and might have been a medieval tower. Children's public art having the specific quality of being multiple things simultaneously without committing to any of them. I walked and I thought about what the week would hold, and about the guys who would come in on Monday and sit in the chairs outside my door and wait to be called, and about what they would bring into the room when they came in, and about how the job of being the person they talked to required a specific kind of capacity that I had built over 11 years in one context and was now applying in another, and how the two things were more similar than most people would expect and less similar than I sometimes wanted them to be, and how that gap between what a person expects and what a thing actually is where most of the important work of being a person ends up living. I walked back to my building and I went upstairs and I made a second cup of coffee, and I stood at the window and I looked at September in Columbus, which is a city I have not always been kind to in my own mind, a city that can feel small against the scale of where I have been, but which on a Sunday morning in autumn has a particular grace to it that I have been learning to let land. The wooden case was on the table. The manila envelope was beside it. The truck was in the parking lot below, its undercarriage, doing whatever my mechanic said it was doing, still getting me where I needed to go. What I want to say at the end of all of this is something I have been working toward for 3 years without knowing I was working toward it. Something that the afternoon in the backyard and the drive home and the text from Derek at 9:15 and the coffee at 6:47 on Sunday morning have all been adding up to the way addition works quietly until the total is suddenly visible. Some of the most significant things that happen in a person's life happen in rooms that no one else ever enters. They happen in forward positions in Kandahar province in October. They happen in bathrooms at parties where someone just called you a quitter. They happen in kitchens at 6 in the morning when a person is looking at a photograph of their daughter on the wall by the window and deciding not to take it down every single morning without ever saying so. They happen in cars on interstate highways at 2 in the afternoon when a man in his 60s who does not owe anyone a 214-mile drive decides to make it anyway. The people who do significant things in rooms no one enters are not waiting to be seen. That is not why they are doing it. They are doing it because it is what the situation requires, and they are the person in the situation, and so it falls to them. And they do it, and they come home, and they eat their chicken, and they sit with their back to the wall, and they answer fine. When you ask how they are, and they mean it, and they are also holding something that no single word will cover. There is a kind of love that does not announce itself. It shows up where it is needed, and it does what is needed, and it does not require that anyone understand what it cost. It does not ask for the banner or the party or the speech. It asks only that the situation eventually improve, that the people who need it to be okay are okay, that the morning comes. It is not the kind of love that looks like love from the outside. It looks like competence. It looks like calm. It looks, if you're not paying attention, like nothing at all. Do not mistake it for nothing at all. Some people carry the heaviest things the quietest. That is not the quitter's way. That is the only way some people know how to love what they love and serve what they serve and still walk back in the next morning to do it again. The silence is not surrender. It is the sound of someone doing the work that needs doing in the room that no one else has entered yet. It is the sound of showing up. It has always been the sound of showing up.